Section 22 of the Treasure Chest of My Book House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. The Treasure Chest of My Book House. Edited by Olive Beaupre Miller. The Memoirs of a White Elephant by Judith Gautier. I was born in the forest of Laos, and regarding my youth I have retained only very confused memories. Occasional punishments inflicted by my mother, when I refused to take my bath, or to follow her in search of food. Some gay frolics with elephants of my own age, pillage of the enemy's fields, and long beatitudes on the border of streams, and in the silent glades of the forest. That is all. When I grew large, I perceived with surprise that the elders of the herd of which I was a member regarded me with disfavor. This pained me, and I would have been glad to think that I was mistaken; but it was evident that no matter what advances were made by me, I was avoided by all. I sought for some cause of this aversion, and soon discovered it by observing my reflection in a pool. I was not like the others. My skin, instead of being like theirs, gray and dingy, was white, and in spots of a pinkish color. How did that happen? Mortification overwhelmed me, and I formed the habit of retiring from the herd which despised me, and of remaining by myself. One day, when I was thus alone, and sad, and humiliated, at a distance from the herd, I noticed a slight noise in the thicket, near me. I parted the branches with my trunk, and saw a singular being who walked on two legs, and yet was not a bird. He wore neither feathers nor fur, but on his skin there shone brilliant stones and bits of bright colors that made him look like a flower. I beheld for the first time a man. An extreme terror seized me, but a curiosity equally intense kept me motionless in the presence of this creature, so small that without the slightest effort I could have crushed him, and yet who in some way appeared to me more formidable and powerful than I. While I was gazing at him he saw me, and instantly threw himself on the ground, making extraordinary motions of which I did not comprehend the meaning, but which did not seem to me to be hostile. After a few moments he rose and retired, bowing at every step, till I lost sight of him. I returned next day to the same spot, in the hope of seeing him again. The man was there, but this time he was not alone. On seeing me, his companions, like himself, performed the same singular movements, throwing themselves on their faces upon the ground, and doubling their bodies backwards and forwards. My astonishment was great, and my fears diminished. I thought the men so pretty, so light and graceful in their motions, that I could not tire of watching them. After a while they went away, and I saw them no more. One day, soon after, when, alone as usual, I descended to the lake to drink, I saw upon the opposite shore an elephant who looked over at me and made friendly signals. It flattered me that he did not seem to feel repelled by my appearance, but on the contrary seemed to admire me, and was disposed to make my acquaintance. But he was a stranger to me, and certainly did not belong to our herd. He gathered some delicate roots, of a kind that we elephants greatly enjoy, and held them out to me, as though to offer them for my acceptance. I hesitated no longer, and began to swim across the lake. On reaching the other side, I gave the polite stranger to understand that I was attracted, not so much by the sight of the delicacies, as by the wish to enjoy his company. He insisted upon my accepting a portion of his hospitality, and began very sociably to eat up the rest. Then, after some gambols which seemed to me very graceful, he moved off, inviting me by his looks to follow. I did not need urging, and we plunged into the forest, running, frolicking, pulling fruits and flowers. I was so delighted with the companionship of my new friend that I took no notice of the direction in which he was leading me. But suddenly I stopped. I saw with uneasiness that I was quite lost. We had come out into a plain that was strange to me, and where in the distance singular objects showed against the sky, tall points the colour of snow, and brilliant red mounds, and smoke, things that seemed to me not natural. Seeing my hesitation, my companion gave me a friendly blow with his trunk, of sufficient force, however, to show more than ordinary strength. My suspicions were not allayed by this blow, under which my flank smarted. I refused to go further. The stranger then uttered a long call, which was answered by similar calls. Seriously frightened now, I turned abruptly toward the forest. A dozen elephants barred the way. He who had so duped me, for what reason I could not imagine, fearing the effects of my indignation, now promptly retired. He set off running, but I was so much larger than he that it seemed easy to overtake him. I rushed in pursuit, but just as I caught up with him I was obliged to stop short. He had entered the open door of a formidable stockade, made of the trunks of giant trees. It was inside that he wished to lead me, to make me a prisoner. I tried to draw back and escape, but I was surrounded by the accomplices of my false friend, who beat me cruelly with their trunks, and at last forced me into the enclosure, the door being at once shut behind me. Seeing myself caught, I uttered my war cry, and charged the palisades, throwing all my weight against them, in the hope of breaking through. I ran madly round the enclosure, thrusting my tusks into the walls, and seizing the timbers with my trunk, endeavouring to wrench them apart. It was against the door that I strove most furiously, but all was useless. My enemies had prudently disappeared. They did not return till I was exhausted, paralysed by my impotent rage, and until, motionless, and with drooping head, I owned myself vanquished. Then he who had lured me into this trap reappeared, and approached me, dragging enormous chains, which he wound round my feet. Groaning deeply, I reproached him with his perfidy, but he gave me to understand that I was in no danger, and that if I would be submissive I would have no cause to regret my lost liberty. The night came. I was left alone, chained in this manner. I strove with desperation to break my manacles, but without success. At last, worn out with grief and fatigue, I threw myself on the ground, and after a time fell asleep. When I opened my eyes the sun was up, and I saw, all standing around the stockade, the elephants of the day before, but out of my reach. They were fastened by the foot by means of a rope which they could have broken without the slightest effort. They were eating with great relish the fine roots and grasses piled up in front of them. I was too sad and mortified to feel hungry, and I looked gloomily at these prisoners, whose happiness and contentment I could not understand. After they had finished eating, some men arrived, and far from showing fear, they saluted them by flapping their ears, giving every sign of joy. Each man seemed to be welcomed by one special elephant, to whom he gave his sole attention. He loosened the rope from the foot, and rubbed the rough skin with an ointment, and then, upon a signal, the captive bent back one of his forelegs to enable the man to mount upon his colossal back. I looked at all this with such astonishment that I almost, for the moment, forgot my own sufferings. And now, each man being seated upon the neck of an elephant, they, one after another, fell into line and marched out of the enclosure, and the gate was shut behind them. I was alone, abandoned. The day was long and cruel. The sun scorched me, and hunger and thirst began to cause me suffering. I struggled no more. My legs were lacerated by the vain efforts I had made. I was prostrate, hopeless, and considered myself as one already dead. At sunset the elephants returned, each one bearing a ration of food, and again I saw them eat joyously, while hunger gnawed my stomach, and no one noticed me. The night again descended. I could no longer suppress my screams, which were more of misery than of rage. Hunger and thirst prevented me from sleeping, even for a moment. In the morning a man came towards me. He stopped at some distance, and began to speak to me. I could not of course understand what he said to me, but his voice was gentle, and he did not appear to threaten me. When he had finished speaking, he uncovered a bowl that he carried filled with some unfamiliar food, the appetizing odor of which made me fairly quiver. Then he came near, and kneeling, held out the bowl to me. I was so famished that I forgot all pride, and even all prudence. I never had tasted anything so delicious, and when the basin was empty, I carefully picked up the smallest crumbs that had fallen on the ground. The elephant who had captured me now drew near, bearing a man on his back. He made me understand, by little slaps of his trunk, that I should bend back one of my forelegs to allow the man who had fed me to get upon my neck. I obeyed, resigned to anything, and the man sprang up very lightly and placed himself near my head. Then he pricked me with an iron, but very gently, just to let me know that he was armed, and that he could hurt me terribly at this point, so sensitive with us, at the least sign of rebellion. Sufficiently warned, I allowed myself to show no impatience. Then they removed my manacles. The other elephant took up the march, and I followed quietly. We left the stockade, and they led me to a pool in which I was permitted to bathe and drink. After the privations I had suffered, the bath seemed so delightful that I could not make up my mind to leave it when the time came. But a prick on the ear told me plainly that I must obey, and I was so afraid of being deprived of food and drink that I rushed out of the water, determined to do all I was bid. We now went towards the strange objects that I had seen in the distance on the plain on the day I was made prisoner. I learned later that it was the city of Bangkok, the capital of Siam. I had never yet beheld a city, and my curiosity was so aroused that I was anxious to reach it. As we drew near, men appeared on the sides of the road, more and more numerously, so that the way was crowded. They stood on each side of the pathway, and to my great surprise I at last discovered that it was I whom they were expecting, and had come out to see. At my approach they uttered shouts of joy, and when I passed before them, they threw themselves face downward upon the earth with extended arms, then rose and followed me. At the gates of the city a procession appeared, and cloth of gold, and arms, and streamers of silk on long poles. All at once there was a noise, so wonderful that I stopped short. One would have said it was composed of shrieks and groans, and claps of thunder, and whistling winds mingled with the songs of birds. I was so terrified that I turned to escape, but found myself trunk to trunk with my companion, who was following me. His perfect tranquillity, and the roguish wink that he gave me, reassured me, and I felt mortified to have exhibited less courage than others before so many spectators, and I wheeled about so promptly that the man on my head did not have time to prick my ear. I was ordered to stop in front of the leader of the procession, who saluted me and made an address. The great and fearful noise had ceased, but began again as soon as this personage had finished his speech. The procession turned around now and preceded me, and we again moved on. I then saw that it was men who were making all the noise. They struck various objects, they tapped them, they whistled into them, and seemed to take the greatest trouble. That which they made was called music. I grew used to it in time, and even came to think it agreeable. I was no longer afraid, and all that I saw interested me, and delighted me greatly. In the city the crowds were even denser, and the rejoicings more noisy. They spread carpets on the route I was to traverse. The houses were wreathed with garlands of flowers, and from the windows they threw phials of perfume, which my rider caught flying, and sprinkled over me. Why were they so glad to see me? Why were all these honors showered upon me? I, who in my own herd had been repulsed and disdained? I could not reply at the time, but later on I learned it was the whiteness of my skin which alone was responsible for all this enthusiasm. That which seemed to elephants a defect seemed admirable to men, and made me more valuable than a treasure. They believed my presence was a sign of happiness, of victory, of prosperity to the kingdom, and they treated me accordingly. We had now reached a great square in front of a magnificent building which might well cause amazement to a wild elephant. Often since then I have seen this palace, and with better understanding, but always with the same astonishment and admiration. It was like a mountain of snow, carved into domes and great stairways, with painted statues, and columns encrusted with jewels, and tipped with globes of crystal that dazzled their eyes. The tall golden points rose higher than the domes, and in many places red standards floated, and on all of them there was a figure of a white elephant. All the court, in costume of ceremony, was assembled on the lower steps of the stairway. Above, on the platform, on either side of the doorway of red and gold, elephants covered with superb housings were ranged, 8 to the right, 8 to the left, all standing motionless. They summoned me to the foot of the stair, and there I was told to stop. A great silence fell upon all. One would have said that there was nobody there. The crowd which had been so noisy now was mute. The red and gold doorway was opened wide, and all the people prostrated themselves, resting their foreheads upon the earth. The King of Siam appeared. He was borne by 4 porters in a pavilion of gold, in which he sat with crossed legs. His robe was covered with jewels and scattered blinding rays. Before him walked young boys dressed in crimson, who waved great bunches of feathers attached to long sticks. Others carried silver basins out of which came clouds of perfumed smoke. I am able to describe all this now, with words which I have learned since then, but at that time I admired without understanding, and I felt as if I was looking upon all the stars of heaven, and the sun at noonday, and all the flowers of the loveliest spring, at one and the same time. The bearers of the king descended the steps in front of me. His Majesty approached. Then my conductor pricked my ear, and my companion struck my leg with his trunk, indicating that I was to kneel. I did so voluntarily, in the presence of such splendor, which seemed to me as if it might burn any one who would touch it. The king inclined his head slightly. The King of Siam had saluted me. I learned afterwards that I was the only one who had ever been honored in such fashion, and I was soon able to return the king's salute, or rather to anticipate it. His Majesty addressed me with a few words which had an agreeable sound. He bestowed on me the name of King Magnanimous, with the rank of Mandarin of the first class. He placed upon my head a chaplet of pearls set with gold and precious stones, and then retired to his palace. The multitude, who until now had remained prostrated, now rose up, and with shouts and cries of joy accompanied me to my own palace, where I was to dwell. It was in a garden, in the midst of an immense lawn. The walls were of sandalwood, and the great roofs extended far out on all sides. They were lacquered in red, and glistened in the sunlight, with here and there globes of copper, and carved likenesses of elephants' heads. I was taken into an immense hall, so high that the red rafters which interlaced overhead and supported the roof made me think of the branches of my native forest, when the sunset reddens them. An old elephant was walking slowly about the hall. As soon as he saw me, he advanced towards me, flapping his ears in welcome. His tusks were ornamented with rings and golden bells, and he wore on his head a diadem like that which the king had just placed on mine. But all this did not improve his appearance. His skin was mottled with dingy patches, like dried earth, and cracked in spots. His eyes and ears were encircled with redness. His tusks were yellow and broken, and he walked with difficulty. But he seemed amiable, and I returned his courtesies. My conductor descended from my neck, while officers and servants prostrated themselves before me, as they had done before the king himself. Then they led me to a huge table of marble, where in great bowls and vessels of silver and gold were bananas, sugar canes, all sorts of delicious fruits and choice grasses, and cakes, and rice, and melted butter. What a feast! Ah, how I wished that those of my herd who had made a mock of me could see how I was treated by man! My heart swelled with pride. Here I was to dwell, and I no longer regretted my liberty and my native forest. Section 23.